Good morning and welcome to the webinar on cost-effective marine restoration, organized by the Nordic Working Group for Environment and Economy. My name is Mikael Bendix, and it's my pleasure to be the moderator for this webinar. I am currently located in Helsinki, together with all the presenters for today, and I hope you can find a cozy place wherever you might be for this online experience. Some technical pointers before we start. We will shortly open officially, but some pointers. The agenda for today is for 3 hours, so we will be working till 1 o'clock Eastern European time. Agenda is split into 2 blocks. We will start with some guest speakers about different case studies and overall setting the scene, and then we will break for around 15 minutes, around 11:15. And after the break, we will have additional presentations, and then we will have a panel to discuss the topics we have currently heard, but also your questions and some insights. So all questions, all inputs, all comments from your side are more than welcome. Feel free to use the chat, and I will ask the technical team to open up the chat right now. We will ask those questions that you have submitted in the panel discussion, but your engagement starts already now. Right before those who have joined us slightly before the opening, you saw some link with a questionnaire. I will ask the technical team to share the link again, and I want you to open that questionnaire and answer short 3 questions. The questions are about the main challenges for restoration, in your opinion. Keep those answers sort of very personal, how you see it, how you understand it, and also about your thoughts about the impact restoration efforts have to the health of marine environment. Regarding the topic, before we start and before we open officially, like with all and any large-scale and long-term activity, also with restoration, the most common questions arise: the why, the what, and the how. If the why question, at least in these circles, are relatively logical and obvious, the ongoing questions of what needs to be done and how it should be done, what needs to be done and how these activities should be conducted are more important than ever. Limited financial, technological, human, and other resources underline the importance of working smart, gaining as much of necessary impact with as little resources as possible. In this context, it means focusing on the most cost-effective way for marine restoration measures. In the Baltic Sea, there are several stakeholders with different level of impact and motivation and opportunities, also different approaches how to conduct these efforts and reach their targets. So the learning curve and sharing experience is more important than ever. What works and what works better, and what is the smartest and the most pragmatic way to conduct restoration? And does one approach and learnings from this approach in one country translate well into other countries and other regions and other areas? Do all involved parties understand the same when using the same words and terms when it comes to the measuring of outputs and outcomes? This webinar and the purpose of this webinar is to visualize and discuss and share the experience that exists today, and also with a look in the future what we can do. I hope that this webinar will be as a small step closer to a broadening of the horizon, adding more knowledge and inspiring ideas in the context of restoration measures and their cost effectiveness. Let's use this opportunity to not only gain some experience but also share it. So I invite you to ask your questions, state your reflections in the chat. But now, without further ado, for the official welcome, I will invite Executive Secretary at the Baltic Marine Environment Protection Commission, Rudiger Stempel, and Lotta Eklund, the Coordinator for the Nordic Group of Environment and Economy.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, good morning and welcome to this webinar on strategies for cost-effective marine restoration in the Nordics. The concept of nature restoration is not new. It is, in fact, part of the traditional ecological knowledge of some indigenous people dating back thousands of years, and has, to varying extents, also been practiced in Western societies since at least the first half of the past century. But in recent years, it's gained impetus. To mention just two examples and two milestones, we have the declaration of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which runs from 2021 to 2030, and most recently, of course, the EU Nature Restoration Law, adopted just a few months ago and on the agenda today. This impetus is a blessing and must be maintained because in the face of the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity, and pollution that we're experiencing, nature restoration will be vitally important. It will be an indispensable piece in the mosaic of measures we need to implement to halt biodiversity loss, which, as we know, continues at an unprecedented and alarming pace, and mitigate and also help us adapt to climate change, which is accelerating. Now, even though everybody here is familiar with, or everybody participating today, not necessarily here, is familiar with the subject, let me nonetheless cite the definition of nature restoration contained in Article 3 of the EU Nature Restoration Law, which reads, "Restoration means the process of actively or passively assisting the recovery of an ecosystem in order to improve its structure and functions with the aim of conserving or enhancing biodiversity and ecosystem resilience through improving an area of a habitat type to good condition, re-establishing a favorable reference area, and improving a habitat of a species to sufficient quality and quantity." I'll let that settle in for a minute, and I think you'll all agree that this is ambitious to the point of being daunting, and possibly even more so when applied to marine ecosystems, which is what we're talking about here today. And make no mistake, this can come with a hefty price tag, which is why it makes sense to do two things. On the one hand, explore cost-effective ways to address the issue, and on the other, seek synergies in addressing it. Today's event aims to do both. We'll be considering cost-effective approaches, and we'll be looking across national boundaries. And what's more, we'll be doing so in a webinar that's co-organized in cooperation between two regional intergovernmental fora, the Nordic Council of Ministers and HELCOM, which are well placed to cooperate in developing scalable solutions to this and other environmental challenges. Because despite many specificities and differences between the various nations, Nordic countries, and indeed countries around the Baltic Sea, share similar environmental challenges, have undertaken similar environmental commitments, and are embedded in the same, or at least closely related and interacting, international political institutional frameworks. Indeed, as we all know, there's partial overlap between the contracting parties to HELCOM and the countries brought together by the Nordic cooperation. Today's event testifies to the promise and potential of cooperation in our region, and I'm especially gratified that it's co-organized by HELCOM and the Nordic Council of Ministers. We share similar values and aspirations. We've cooperated successfully in the past, and I look forward to our continued and hopefully enhanced cooperation in the future. I'd like to take this opportunity to express our deep appreciation for the financial support provided by the Nordic Council of Ministers, enabling this webinar to take place. My thanks also go to all those involved in organizing today's event, to all speakers and panelists, and to all participants. I wish us all an inspiring and fruitful webinar, and thank you very much.
A very good morning to you all on my behalf also. It is my great pleasure to, on behalf of the Nordic Working Group for Environment and Economy, to welcome you all to this webinar on strategies for cost-effective marine restorations. First of all, I'm very grateful that we can collaborate with HELCOM on this. The working group's expertise is more in the field of economic instruments, regulations and policies, not so much on the marine environment and practical restoration measures. So thank you for that. Today we will discuss a crucial and timely topic, the EU's biodiversity strategy for 2030 and the nature restoration law that sets ambitious targets to restore degraded ecosystems, including marine environments. This is an issue that is highly relevant from the Nordic perspective too. Most of the Nordic countries are members of the EU and have large maritime areas. Even the political interest in the state of nature in the seas has increased through the EU regulation, which is not that surprising when it involves obligations and high costs. Members of the working group felt that there were no, or at least they were not aware of socioeconomic analysis of restoration measures in the marine environment, which could be used for policy development and decision making in this process. Without socioeconomic analysis, it is difficult to compare costs and benefits of different measures and prioritize actions. In meeting the targets of the EU regulation, benefits are not in focus, at this moment at least. So cost effectiveness is of particular relevance. In other words, how can we get as much restored marine environment as possible at the lowest costs? The purpose of this webinar is to share knowledge, experiences and ideas on how we in the Nordic region can best implement efforts to restore our marine environments. I look forward to today's presentations and discussions, and I hope you will all find the webinar engaging and inspiring. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Rudiger and Lotta. We will continue with the presentations to set the scene and to slowly feed us into the topic of nature restoration and the cost efficiency and also the case study that we have planned for you today. We will kick this off with a story from Vedran Nikolic, from European Commission, to share your information about EU nature restoration law that is as a frame that we need to work within. So Vedran, I hope you can hear me. I hope you're there. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone in Helsinki and good morning to all participants online. Thank you very much for inviting me today to set the scene on behalf of European Commission. I will speak about the main obligations stemming from the nature restoration regulation with the focus on marine ecosystems because we don't have time to go into much detail. This is a new, very comprehensive and very complex law. It's quite technical in some of its parts, but it is really important to understand what it aims to achieve, especially in the marine environment. I have to say that we in the European Commission, we are very proud of this law, and especially in our little team here in DG Environment, who has worked on the design and negotiations and implementation of the law. As you may know, it's first law of its kind in the world. We really hope it will be a game changer for restoration, in particular for marine ecosystems. And I'm sure that in the audience, you must be aware of quite a bumpy ride that this law has had during negotiations and towards its adoption. And we are very happy that we have it now. And we are actually now looking very much forward to the implementation phase. So the next slide, please. Just to set the scene, why did we propose this law? Well, it's quite obvious that we have today a continuing ecosystem degradation of biodiversity in the EU. We have had that recorded for a long time. It impacts our biodiversity, but also impacts our ability to resist the climate change, and we can see it through the disasters across Europe, natural disasters, and simply because voluntary targets set in the biodiversity strategy for the last decade did not materialize, we thought it was time to set legal obligations for restoration. And we actually realized that according to all the information that we have, that our economies, all our businesses depend on healthy ecosystems. And if we want to have healthy economy and healthy society, we need those healthy ecosystems. That's why we proposed 2 years ago this groundbreaking legislation. And how does it fit into overall environmental legislation in the EU? You can see on this slide, it's a missing puzzle if you want. It builds on and complements existing EU environmental legislation in the field of nature, so the Birds and Habitats Directives, but also Water Framework Directive, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, but also our climate legislation. Because of the urgency to act on the biodiversity loss, we decided that this law should take a form of regulation, which means it applies directly to member states after its adoption. And actually now, since August this year, the law is completely in force, and we are now focusing fully on the implementation phase of the law. Now, in the next slide, I will try to explain briefly what are the main objectives and framework for implementation of this law. Well, first, there is an overarching objective for its implementation, and that is to have in place by 2030 restoration measures which would cover 20% of EU land and 20% of EU seas. That's an overarching EU objective. And to have all ecosystems in need of restoration covered by restoration measures by 2050. And on the right side, you can see the main objectives that we aim to achieve. Well, first and foremost, that's the recovery of ecosystems, but then also to help our climate action and the land degradation neutrality objectives, also to enhance food security, because we know healthy ecosystems are a prerequisite for that, but above all, also to contribute to our international commitments set under the Convention of Biological Diversity for restoration. The regulation sets binding restoration targets. That's really at the core of this legislation. I will explain these obligations a bit later, but these restoration targets are very comprehensive, they are legally binding, and they should deliver what we need with this law. It aims to implement effective area-based restoration measures. The way that this should be done is through planning first, and at the core of the law, at the core of its implementation framework, is the creation of the national restoration plans that each country will have to design in 2 years from its adoption. So by August 2026, which we admit is extremely ambitious, each country would have to have a national restoration plan, which would then also be revised periodically. In the introduction, it was also mentioned the definition of restoration. It encompasses a wide range of actions from reducing environmental pressures to habitats and species and ecosystems, but also through active restoration also of the habitats that have been lost in the past. On the next slide, you can see the core of law of the legislation, which lists all the specific restoration targets. They are grouped per ecosystem type. You can see that there almost isn't a part of our nature or ecosystems that isn't covered by the legislation. Even urban ecosystems, the agro ecosystems, forest ecosystems, pollinators as a specific group of targets are covered. But what interests us today most is those targets related to marine and coastal ecosystems, and those are circled in red. First, the law covers all habitats and species protected by EU nature legislation, by habitats and birds directives, but also in the marine environment, it goes beyond by covering all marine ecosystems protected by the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. Now, to dive a bit further in the next slide on what countries will need to do on the actual obligations for marine ecosystems. I put this to be also a bit frightening, just to show you how complex and detailed these obligations are. And this is just a simple list. It aims to summarize long and somewhat complex articles in the regulation for what concerns marine ecosystems. But I will try to explain a bit what this law requires from the countries for marine ecosystems. Well, there are, if you want, 3 main obligations. to do in marine ecosystems that I want to highlight. First is the restoration of seabed habitats. The second is the closing of the knowledge gaps on the condition of those seabed habitats. And the third is about restoration of habitats of species. Now, I will try to explain what actually needs to be done, but in the Commission, we realized that we need a better way to present this. We're actually making some videos and very other ways to try to help us to explain. They're not ready yet, so bear with me while I try to explain these three main obligations. In relation to the seabed habitats, there are some 230 communities, biological communities on the seabed that should be restored, and they are divided into regional groups, and one of them is, of course, the Baltic Sea, and they are furthermore divided into these groups, as you can see on the screen, which are wide groups of habitats: seagrass beds, macroalgal forests, shellfish, marl beds, coral, sponge beds, and so on, and soft sediments. Now, these are all biodiversity-rich habitats. There are also spawning and nursery areas for fish. They have also, some of them, very significant role in capturing and storing carbon. So they are key to restore, to achieve all these objectives. And the requirement is to put in place restoration measures in areas where these habitats are in bad condition. So we are restoring habitats where they are in bad condition, and we should do it progressively. So the countries need to put in place by 2030 the restoration measures in the 30% of the degraded areas of these habitats, then by 2040 at 60%, and then finally to cover 90% of the area which is currently in bad condition by 2050. And then this recognizes that by putting in place measures, it will take some time until these habitats are actually restored. But there is a progression to achieve that through time. There are some differences between each of the habitats, and for soft sediments, these targets have been aligned with the obligations under the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. Now, besides improving the existing areas of the habitats in bad condition, there is another obligation to re-establish habitats where they have been lost in the past, where we have simply lost them. And some of them have been lost also in the Baltic Sea, and I know that there have been activities like re-establishing boulder reefs in the Baltic. That is the re-establishment to reach the so-called favorable reference area of these habitats, to have the quantity of them that used to be in the past, or at least that should enable them to be viable in the future. About the level of detail of the habitats, I will show it in the next slide, but let's just keep this slide for a moment to show other obligations. Habitats of species should be restored, covered by Habitats and Birds directives. So all cetaceans, you have the Baltic porpoise in the Baltic Sea, so its habitat should be restored. You don't have sea turtles, but you have other species which are covered by this obligation. And then what is really significant at this moment of implementation is that we have significant knowledge gaps about where these habitats are and what is their condition, and that is hindering our progress. So there is an obligation by certain deadlines to know the condition, to know the area and the condition of these habitats. There is also an obligation to prevent deterioration. We don't want to restore in one place and just to lose the habitat in another. And then finally, there are some improvements in the way that the common fishery should be used for restoration. So to put in place fisheries measures to restore habitats, there are some new deadlines introduced. And like any other law, on the right side, you can see derogations and certain flexibilities for countries when it concerns projects of overriding public interest like renewable energy, but also defense, which is important in the current context. Now, let's move to the next slide just quickly to show you, at least to the experts in the room and online, what we aim to restore. These habitats are divided into these categories, and on the right side, you can see the biological communities that should be actually restored by these actions. Just to know that of course, everybody recognizes that there is a big uncertainty in the marine environment when it comes to restoration. There are a lot of factors that can influence restoration success, so that we recognize that for many of these habitats, that will be the main challenge. And also we recognize that there may be many different ways to restore, including by protecting, by strict protection, by marine protected areas. So on the next slide, I just wanted to show you an example from the south of a small scale. Sorry, it's on the following slide. The small scale restoration through a project which was done in Spain. It concerns restoration of coral reefs, and it shows how it is done with fishers, how it was science-based, how it benefited the communities, because we want restoration action to benefit communities, not just ecosystems, but also society. And this is a very good example which shows engagement of all actors in restoration, the fishers organizations, the local governments, the science, and through smart investment and measures, but also through protection of these areas which are being restored actively, it was shown that fishers benefit a better catch and that everyone is in the end happy. That's what we want to see upscaled. And on that road, and please come back to the previous slide, sorry for that, there are challenges to be resolved, and I hope that in this webinar today you will speak about some of them. The first one is the knowledge gap, as I said, on the condition of the habitats, where to restore. The second one is about the knowledge and practice, the know-how of restoration. It's still limited to some of the habitats and to some of the areas. And the third is actually the small scale restoration, which is happening today, which really needs to be upscaled to significant areas. And like it was said in the beginning, we have to do it in a smart way, so to be also cost effective and to enhance the cooperation of all countries in sharing the knowledge. So please skip to the next slide after the next one. This is just to recap what the countries will need to do, also in terms of financing. So the preparation of the national restoration plans, we hope, has already started, and all the preparatory actions to really come up with the necessary measures. What is important, the national restoration plans will contain the financing needs, the estimated financing needs for the implementation of restoration measures, and the means of financing. And would it be public or private, including the use of EU funding instruments? That's very important for us also to be able to plan the support from EU budget. And what is important in the context of cooperation in marine region, and also for HELCOM and Nordic countries, is the obligation in the law to foster synergies between national restoration plan of member states, in particular when they share marine region. And there's a role for the regional sea conventions, and the law says that member states may, for preparation and implementation of the plans, use existing regional cooperation structures like the HELCOM. And on the last slide, my last message for you today is about the support that the Commission and will put in place. We are now putting in place a specific LIFE project to support the mapping, condition assessment, and restoration measures to support countries in creating their national restoration plans. There will be many, many workshops and meetings on this. We'll put out various guidance documents, and there are currently many projects and significant financial resources, as you can see on the right, in particular through Horizon Europe, that can help the countries also to plan, but also to implement restoration. And when it comes to funding and financing, we will come next year with a report on funding needs and an overview of the EU financial resources, but also an analysis of the funding gaps. And we would be very interested if from this workshop we can get also some input valuable for that report in terms of needs and gaps. That's in a nutshell the main points of what that I wanted to convey to you today. Just to finish with the message that the Commission is here very excited about the implementation and ready to support the countries in this joint voyage. And you may know that the new Commission is now in the office since Sunday. We have our new commissioner in charge of environment. She's from Sweden, Jessica Roswell, and she has clearly said that the implementation is the most important in the following years to continue with ambitious environment policy to deliver on our international commitments. And we are here to accompany you in this voyage and to work with you on marine restoration. Thanks again for inviting me, and I wish you a good webinar.
Thank you very much, Vedran Nikolic. Thank you for the insight to EU nature restoration law. I'm glad to see that there was also a slide about the support of implementation, because that's important. As you just mentioned, it's all about actions and taking action and actually reaching the impacts. Making a framework is one thing, but actually executing it's completely another thing. So thank you very much for that. We will continue with on topic of cost effectiveness and marine restoration and how those two align, because I think majority of us understand very well cost efficiency in multiple different domains, but how does that feed into marine restoration? I present to you Dr. Venting Chen from the Norwegian Institute of Water Research. Hello, Ms. Chen. I hope that you hear me well. You're also online, not here in Helsinki. You will share your slides. I just invite you to quickly check if you can share your slides. If not, we can fix it for you here.
And yes, I can try test. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we see them. If you put full screen, then I think we're good to go. Yeah, it seems perfect. So the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. So today I'll present the cost effectiveness of marine ecosystem restoration. So I'm senior researcher from Norwegian Institute for Water Research. And yeah, so marine ecosystem has facing tremendous challenges in the recent years. And most of the habitats has been in degraded status. And the recent EA report on European climate risk assessment has shown that both coastal ecosystem and the marine ecosystem are facing critical to catastrophic impacts from climate change. And this year, we know the Ocean Health Index, which shows how much whether the ocean is healthy enough to provide us important ecosystem services and to serve the to provide the benefits to people. And this year's 2023 Ocean Health Index is only 73 out of 100, which shows that the ocean actually is not healthy enough to provide the ecosystem services and the benefits to human beings. Yeah, we have heard our keynote presentations about EU restoration laws, and we know that most of the ocean habitats are in bad condition, and we must restore at least 30% of habitats in poor condition by 2030 and 60% by 2040 and 90% by 2050. And we know that so there are a lot of requirements for to restore those degraded habitats, but we also know that restoration costs are high, particularly in the marine ecosystem, due to many different factors. And there are actually several reviews have been done in the literature to show that how much marine ecosystem restoration can cost. We see that, so here is the example on the right side table. The restoration cost can vary a lot. You can see that it varies. It can be relatively cheap for example, some type of the salt marsh restoration, they can go very expensive for other type of ecosystem restoration, like coral reef restoration, and also we see that yeah, and also seagrass restoration. Yeah, and also so we know that the cost is high, and then so what we should do when we have different scenarios in front of us, different measures in front of us for restoration with different costs. We know that marine ecosystem can be restored by different measures. So the figure on the right shows that the different ways, different measures we can use to restore, for example, the kelp forest. So we can use the transplanting methods, or we can use different seeding methods, and we can use also the controlling the predator, controlling the grazer, and at the same time we can also use artificial reefs. There are also lots of future and techniques that we can use, maybe in very use different advanced technologies. So there's one thing that is for sure, that various measures require different costs and will generate various outcomes. And some of these outcomes, the benefits, can be valued with monetary values, whilst others not. So one of the policy relevant questions in terms of making a decision on what measures should be used is, what restoration measures should we invest in to achieve the restoration targets and at the same time minimize costs? So cost effectiveness or cost effectiveness analysis is usually used for used in the economic project appraisal traditionally, and in the context of marine ecosystem restoration, cost effectiveness analysis is suitable for the restoration projects where benefits are not expressed in monetary terms. So the costs of different measures can be compared given the restoration target is achieved. So that means we even though we have different measures, if we want to comparing the costs across measures in a meaningful way, we should set a target, which means that all the different measures will achieve the same restoration target. And but there is one key point here, is that different methods achieve the same target at different time span and with different degree of certainty. There's one finished EU Horizon 2020 project in Moses. We developed an approach to connect the effectiveness to reach the target, restoration target, with the minimum success rate of restoration, consider also the restoration uncertainties. And we further applied these methods recently to the Horizon Europe project, Invest for Nature, and also the mission project Agura. And we also applied the methodology to the project that has been finished, which is called Future Maris. So in the table on the right, I showed an example of how this kind of cost effectiveness analysis could look like. So here you have 3 measures: measure 1, measure 2, and measure 3. So the restoration target we set is that all the measures Sorry, you have like a little bit background noise because I'm in the airport. So all the measures, we set the target successful rate at 95%. And so different measures have, when we do restoration, we do, different attempts, right? We restore it once. Then it doesn't mean that we can reach the target success rate. So for measure 1, what if we do just one attempt restoration, the expected success rate at with this attempt is at 45%. And we can see that measure 2, it has a little bit higher, much higher success rate at one restoration attempt. That's 90%. And the measure 3 is also low. It's like 35% success rate at each restoration attempt. That means for measure 1 and measure 3, we need to do more attempts of restoration. And that means, for example, in this case, we need to do 6 attempts of restoration for measure 1, and for measure 3, we need to do 7 attempts. But for measure 2, in the middle column, we only need to do 2 attempts. So the costs for per square meter restoration costs, measure 1 and measure 1 is high, and the measure 2 and 3 are low. So we can see that in the end, the focus actually is comparing measure 2 and measure 3, right? Measure 1 is expensive and low efficiency, low success rate. Then we will not use that one. But for measure 2 and measure 3, then we know that, okay, measure 2 is high success rate, although it has relatively high cost per square meter. But the total, considering the number of attempts we need, the total cost is still lower than measure 3, where the success rate is low, even though the cost is low, but the success rate is low for each attempt. So we need more attempts so that the total cost will be high under measure 3. So that the final cost effectiveness analysis outcome will recommend measure 2. So this is the example which we thought is quite applicable and makes sense for in the context of marine ecosystem restoration. Yes, and so now we know that what kind of methods might be viable, and but there's another thing I want to stress is that marine restoration, there are a lot of experiments going on, but we know that the success rate generally low, and then we find out actually most the reason could partly be lies in we haven't controlled the background environment for the ecosystem, for the habitats restoration. We haven't controlled the stressors which could affect the success rate of marine habitats restoration. For example, the multiple impacts that could affect the marine habitats, which also further affect the restoration success, will be that the impacts of trawling on the seafloor, for example, the discharge from aquaculture and agriculture, invasive species, marine litter, and overfishing. So it's important when we do marine restoration, also trying to control the stressor, and in terms of the costs, also it's important to include the costs for stressor control as part of the restoration measures. Here I want to stress that so here we're talking about active restoration activity, but we shouldn't forget about the passive restoration measures, which we are very familiar with before. That is the marine protected area and also other various types of marine conservation. So these costs, if these measures are done together with active ecosystem restoration, and the costs related to these measures, the conservation and the stressor control should also be included and considered. And the last slide I will mention quickly is that in the cost effectiveness analysis, we also should consider and deal with uncertainty. So the uncertainty means that, okay, there are a lot of questions, right? Whether we could shift the highly degraded state to original state, whether there is a good pathways to recovery, and okay, if it's recovered, is there alternative function to reach different status, and for either mitigations for mitigation purpose or for adaptation purpose. So there are different variety of certainties. There are three main type of certainties which been categorized by a paper from 2018, where we thought that the uncertainties could from the incomplete knowledge about the data set and also the costs, the data you collected, and also the how long period we need to restore to achieve the targets, right? And the time span, and also the success rate, of course, is incomplete knowledge, and also. Yeah, and also the future trend of, for example, the interest rate change, because when you do the cost effectiveness, you know that we have considered the discount rate effects, and another part of that type of uncertainty is called predictability, and of course, and there is a third type is called ambiguity. I think for details, we can also go back to the paper to have a read. So the major take-home message is that for the cost effectiveness, finally we shouldn't get just a number. We should get a range to consider to take into account all this variety of uncertainties. So there are multiple methods that could do the analysis to consider all these multiple uncertainties. So yes, thank you very much. If you have more questions, you can email me and ask. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. If you still have a minute till your airplane, I understand if you're not boarding yet. There's a question from the audience regarding one of your slides where you mentioned the measures. Are these measures supposed to be exhaustive? Meaning, for example, removal of invasive vegetation is not listed there. So I assume that the question is about the measures. Is that an exhaustive list, or, as you mentioned in the end, anything goes as long as it's cost effective and we can calculate that?
Yeah, I think it's very important that the cost of the measures should be kind of tuned to the local restoration and situation, and tuned to different species. We know that different species, different habitats, we have different variety of methods to restore them. So the table I showed and I mentioned is some lists of measures for kelp forest restoration. So we know that for the coral reef restoration and for seaweeds, seagrass restoration and salt marsh, they all have different techniques. So yes, I think each case we have to be tuned to the local situation, and measures also varies from country to country and from location to location, even within the same country.
So localization over theoretical approach, what should be working. Thank you very much, Dr. Chen, for taking the time. We move forward with our agenda, and we move forward up to north. I invite to speak Laura Wendling from Arctic Marine Ecosystem Restoration Insights from Svalbard. So Laura, floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me today. So I'm here representing the Klimarest project, which is coordinated by Sintef Ocean. And I'm going to talk about some of the work that we're doing in Svalbard and maybe briefly mention a few of, give a little oversight of the project's activities. So we're looking at coastal climate resilience and marine restoration tools for an Arctic Atlantic basin. This is a large-scale restoration project funded by the EU mission Restore Our Oceans and Waters. It's an innovation action that started in 2023 and will, or 2022, sorry, and will end in 2025 after 3 years. So we have about 1 year left in the project, and we've made really nice progress and are starting to get a pretty good understanding of costs and benefits. And this is going to form part of this toolbox. So the idea is that when the project finishes, we'll have this toolbox that consists of these modular interoperable tools and processes that can help guide people through restoration processes in their own context. So these should be very adaptable. And obviously, when we're talking about cost and benefits, our absolute numbers, the values that we generate won't be directly applicable, but should give a very good ballpark idea of how much things cost, what kind of benefits we might expect. So what we're doing in our toolbox is integrating this expert knowledge with processes and techniques to really engage local stakeholders and try to get a very full range of stakeholder participation in restoration activities. Understanding ecosystem services assessment, how can we do this effectively? Again, the cost-benefit analysis techniques, examples of how we have used this and how you can upscale. Understandings of action prioritization, customized protocols, and this gets a little bit into what Wenting was just saying about everything is a unique situation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one of 5 very unique environments in which Klimarest project is working on ecosystem restoration. So we're focused on the Arctic Atlantic basin, and where I want to talk about today is the coastal erosion and pollution restoration actions that we have ongoing in Svalbard. But we have 4 other really interesting sites. So we're looking at seagrass meadow restoration in Ireland. I believe there are 3 active restoration sites in Galway Bay and Tralee Bay, and 2 more planned. We're looking at oyster reef restoration, so the European flat oysters in Brittany in France is very active work going on there. Understanding how we can better restore European blue lobsters under aquaculture, under the mussel aquaculture in Galicia in Spain. And we're examining restoration of rocky bottom algae forests in Madeira and the pressures, how to mitigate the pressures from invasive sea urchins in that space. So our project has 18 partners in 7 countries, and these are our 5 large innovation action areas, and there are replication sites in Sweden, Croatia, and Cyprus at the moment. So getting into Svalbard. Svalbard is a unique and interesting environment. It's a fascinating coastal zone. And it's really under a lot of pressure, not only anthropogenic, but climate change in particular. So what we see is that Svalbard experiences global warming at a rate that is much greater than what we see average globally. So the warming rates are between 2 and 2.5 times that we see in the Arctic. And we already know that the Arctic is experiencing warming at a greater rate than the rest of the world. So it's about 5 to 7 times the rate of warming that's observed as a global average. So you can understand that this is a real concern, and it puts a lot of pressure on marine and marine coastal systems. This is particularly important where we see that there's shallow bathymetry, so the wave action is very erosive at the coastline. The coastline is a permafrost coastline, so as it warms, the permafrost melts and it makes that sediment less stable. So the soil has very low bearing capacity. It's a sedimentary bedrock. As a result, we need to work on how we can prevent coastal erosion. So there's 2 different aspects here with coastal erosion. We not only want to maintain the integrity of the benthic ecosystem at the coast, but we also want to make sure that the people who live on the coastline can continue to do so, that we don't have our infrastructure eroding, that we want intact social ecological systems. So our objectives overall are to conserve and protect biodiversity, obviously, as part of our intact ecosystem, but really to have this minimal environmental footprint, so that we can sustainably live on Arctic coastlines in Svalbard in the long term. So part of the objective was to do this very much hand in hand with the local community. So we've employed extensive co-creation to engage with local community members and make sure that everyone has a voice. So this is not only about protecting the ecosystem and then setting it aside and people can't use it, but understanding how people interact with this environment, how we use the ecosystem and its services, and how do we value it? What does it mean to us, and how do people prioritize the activities? This is really, really important when we're looking at financing in the future. So where a lot of the time we see that money for environmental action is coming from public sources, but we need to see a significant increase in private finance. So engaging a full range of stakeholders and really getting buy-in from those stakeholders is going to be critical to address the adaptation finance gap. And ultimately, we want to optimize affordability, technical simplicity, and the effectiveness through design. So we want it to be cheap and work perfectly and be really adaptable to any environment. So simple, right? We are on the restoration sort of continuum at the remediation rehabilitation phase on this coastal restoration. And what we're working on is replacing artificial landforms with something that is more natural. So we're calling it a hybrid nature-based solution. We're trying to incorporate as much natural features and nature as possible within the design, but also it's very technically robust, using the best available engineering technology so that we have reliability coupled with environmental sensitivity. And the image that is shown here is showing that eroded coastline. You can see how very sensitive that is to wave action. The other aspect of what we're looking at in Svalbard is perhaps something you might not necessarily immediately think of when we say ecosystem restoration, but we're looking at reducing the impact from wastewater. So Svalbard is an incredibly beautiful place. It's an oligotrophic Arctic environment, and what we see is that in the community of Longyearbyen, there are 2,500 residents, and everyone in Longyearbyen has wastewater treatment. The wastewater is centrally collected, and it's moved to a discharge point in glycol-lined pipes that are actually quite near the surface because of the permafrost. And then it's treated in these small buildings that you see. So the arrows are showing, this is fantastic graphic ability here. The arrows are showing how, the wastewater is coming in to the small building and being treated, and then it's effectively discharged to Advent Fjord. And most of us, when we think about wastewater, if we think about wastewater at all, assume that when we flush something, it is magically treated, and what is discharged to the environment then is virtually pristine, or we hope so. But that's not the case here. What we have for treatment is basically mechanical sieve. So we have a 6mm sieve in Longyearbyen that is removing the big chunks. What we needed to do was to reduce the pressure on the system while we seek an optimal solution. So there are a lot of limitations on the type of wastewater system, treatment system that can be implemented simply due to the location and the environment. So we needed to engage the community and the tourists, so not only the people who live in Longyearbyen, but all the people who come to visit, in only putting things in the toilet that should go in the toilet. So again, it may sound a little bit silly, but it was really, really critically important. We put stickers on toilets reminding people that what you flush could end up in the fjord. And we have a video that, very nice video of toilet flushing. I won't link to it now because I'm afraid it won't work. And I don't want to mess up the webinar, but I'm sure the slides will be made available later. And you can see it's a 20-second video that just gives a nice overview of why it's so important to just be aware of what we're putting in the toilet. And as I said, the purpose was really just to buy us time, to reduce the pressure while we figure out how we can do this in the most cost-effective way. So here's my cost-benefit analysis. So far, this is an estimate of our costs. And we've been doing a lot of research as we've been going. So it's quite possible that the costs that are associated in particular with personnel time in a similar situation would be quite reduced. But we started out with doing a baseline analysis. This is applicable in both the coastal erosion and wastewater case to really understand what impacts are we seeing on the local environment. How does this compare to a pristine site in an unaffected fjord? So we did local workshops with key stakeholders. I've heard a lot of talk that really engaging with stakeholders can be so time-consuming and costly, but what we found was that it wasn't costly at all. The benefit of the local and traditional ecological knowledge far outweighs any cost associated with having multiple workshops and continuing that engagement with the local stakeholders. Our greatest costs by far were associated with the sampling and analysis of the fjord waters and sediments. I think we all probably understand the challenges inherent in collecting samples. This is maybe a little bit more complicated in very remote areas like Svalbard. So there's quite a bit of work put into preparation for field campaigns that probably more than normal, and shipping costs. So you can see shipping costs were not insignificant. Personnel time, and then I guess the sample analysis. So we had a lot of different types of sample analysis as well. So a lot of cases we can reduce some of these costs by linking with, say, recipient investigations for local wastewater systems, and that can help reduce in the long run. Finally, I should just say that our campaign primarily targeted visitors to Svalbard. So although we only have 2,500 permanent residents in Longyearbyen, in 2023, there are 140,000 overnight stays. So this would be one person staying for one night. So that's a very significant number of people visiting the community. I'm going to end with this slide talking about our lessons learned. So we are still in the process of identifying the benefits. And despite the sorts of limitations and assumptions that will go into evaluating the benefits that are derived from ecosystem restoration, we think that the outcomes of our analysis are going to be useful just to provide a framework. And, as I mentioned earlier, the absolute values, the numbers, are unlikely to be directly transferable. Things cost different things in different countries, personnel time, materials, but we should have a very good understanding of a ballpark figure and the relative cost, which phases of a project are most costly, where can we see opportunities to increase efficiency. In Svalbard, we're faced with limited funds, materials, equipment, personnel, and logistical challenges, but that's probably just about anywhere. Maybe more logistical challenges in Svalbard than some other places. Again, the relative cost versus availability of funds for different phases is something that is important and that we're working on understanding. We saw that most of our costs were really associated with the analysis. So that was an important lesson. The broad engagement of stakeholders, again, is absolutely critical, and we believe that this is going to be extremely beneficial in the future. It's already been beneficial to understand get local information, the insider knowledge about the ecosystems, but having the community behind us, behind the project, understanding the importance of ecosystem restoration will be critically important in the future, and will certainly inspire private investment, increased private investment. We see that non-structural roles are equally as important as structural roles. So it's not only what we build, it's also how we understand the systems and how we protect them, how we use them. So this gets into the sustainable use and management aspect that was mentioned earlier. We're trying to reuse materials as much as possible. Because we have limited materials in Svalbard, we're reusing timber and timber revetments and rock rubble. There may be opportunities to, say, recycle concrete. So we can also contribute to other EU initiatives around circularity, which is excellent. And as I sort of mentioned earlier, we are currently working to exploit and would recommend that everyone else also exploit the full range of existing data and opportunities for citizen science. So use what we have and keep the community engaged by allowing them to have an active role. And finally, combining initiatives impossible and using systems thinking. Nothing happens in isolation. And we see this as especially important. So we can take two very disparate things, for example, what we're doing in Svalbard. So looking at coastal restoration, coastal erosion, and wastewater, you'd think they have nothing in common. But together, they make a really important picture and help us to restore the system. So that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura, for the very practical insight of how the cost is broken down, and also underlining the heavy importance of co-creation and involving both local communities and also people, also tourists, that 2,500 versus 140,000 tourists. That's a big underlying how different stakeholders are involved in this. But we move forward. Before a short break, I invite Sanna Kuningas to talk about the habitat restorations in the coastal lagoons in Finland. So, Sanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Sanna Kuningas, and I come from the Natural Resources Institute, Finland. And I want to highlight you the acronym LUKE here that you will see in the slides in the future. So that is the short version of the institute in Finnish. And I will give you some examples from the coastal lagoon restorations in the Finnish coast, and some sort of price ranges that we are talking about, particularly once we are restoring these coastal lagoons for fish spawning areas. Shortly first about the Life IP biodiversity project that we have currently ongoing. This is Finland's largest cooperation project to safeguard the diverse nature of the Baltic Sea. Altogether, we have approximately 20 million euros for the 8 years for this project between the 9 partners. And just for the restoration of these coastal lagoons for fish spawning areas, Luke has 567,000 euros. As you can see, biodiversity project is working on a number of different kind of themes, but today we will be focusing on the restoration of species habitats. Colleagues at the Metsähallitus and Åbo Academy are also working on species restorations such as Zostera marina in the Finnish coastal area and also on the Åland Islands. But we will focus on these restorations on the coastal lagoons that Luke is doing to enhance the natural reproduction of spring spawning fish, particularly perch and pike. Why these coastal lagoons are so important if we talk about spring spawning fish? As you can maybe see on the images on the right, the coastal lagoons are very sheltered, and also in the springtime particularly the water temperature is much more higher in these coastal lagoons compared to the open sea. And these are really the kind of key elements once we are talking about the success of the spring spawning fish to reproduce young. In the biodiversity project, we have a goal to restore at least 20 coastal lagoons along the Finnish coast. So we are talking about from all the way from the end of Bay of Bothnia to the eastern Gulf of Finland. Coastal lagoons are constantly disappearing, but also forming along the Finnish coast. Still, after the ice age, our land is uplifting up to like 8 millimeters per year. And this process of the land uplift is forming these coastal lagoons from the open bay towards the kind of glue flood stage, as you can see on the images below. So it's a natural process that we are losing these habitats, but also new ones are forming. Unfortunately, there's also some human induced pressures facing these coastal lagoons, and here are two very typical examples that we are dealing with when we were talking about coastal lagoons. On the left-hand side image, you can see a lagoon where the channel has been dredged open. This is done typically for the purposes of boating. As you can see in the image, in the lagoon, there's several piers and boats. Also, in the 90s, maybe in the 80s also, there was an idea of needing to open these lagoons so that the water would change and we would fight also the impacts of eutrophication in these locations. But at that time, it wasn't really realized that then you're actually ruining the key elements of the shelter and the temperature of these locations. So now we are working on kind of reversing some of this damage that has been done. And then on the right-hand side image, you can see another coastal lagoon, which is due to eutrophication, a lot of these reed belts that are growing everywhere on our coast. They are very fastly increasing and they are kind of overriding the process of natural uplift that would, in years, it would separate the lagoon from the sea. But when this reed belt is growing really fast, it will close up the channel that the fish are using to migrate to the lagoon and back. So then, just to give you some examples of the types of restorations and also the costs that are related to these restoration processes. On the left-hand side, you have two images of these kind of channel opening, which are related to this eutrophication and the reed belts growing really fast. On the upper example, as light methods as opening these channels by hand can be done. But then again, like in some locations, it might be a bit more challenging and you need some machinery to work on. And then, of course, the costs will get a little bit higher when you need to hire the machinery and also the materials can be quite costly. Then on the right-hand side, there's an example of a glue flood where there was a channel which was opened a bit too widely. And by putting some rock materials into this channel, you can increase the chance that the fish could actually migrate through a culvert which was associated into this stream. And in that example, also the materials were very cheap. If we're talking about 500 euros to get the needed materials for that restoration. But really the key message in this one is that what is really costly on these restorations is the work that is done before the restoration, which entails things like mapping the location beforehand, making the restoration plan, connecting all the relevant stakeholders, such as also the landowners and water owners, and getting all the needed permissions for this restoration. And also very important, but also very costly part of the restoration is the monitoring that is really vital to do after all the restorations, that we can see that we are actually getting the benefits that we were hoping for. Couple of more examples from the Helmi Habitats program that also the Life IP Biodiversity Project is cooperating with, and we're trying to find synergies in finding locations that we can work together. There on a lower image, there's one example of restoring the dredged channel. And that example is showing you how cheap it can be, especially if you can find the material on the location when we are talking about rocks that you are putting back into the channel and make it back to its natural state. We're talking about just 3,100 euros, well, plus the VAT on it, but still, if we're talking about around 5,000 euros, that could be as cheap as that. Helmi Habitats program has used a lot of consultants to do the restoration plans, and typically, at least in Finland, the restoration plans, when they are done as a consultant work, we are talking about something like 1,000 to 4,000 euros. Then if we look at the kind of like the Finland coastal scale in here, and we're talking about these coastal lagoons where the threshold has been dredged. Our colleagues in Metsähallitus have done extensive work on looking at aerial images throughout the whole Finnish coast and identified all of the coastal lagoons where the threshold has been dredged. And if thinking about that, one lagoon restoration would be approximately 16,000 euros. You're looking at a total price tag of 14.5 million euros just to restore all these coastal lagoons. And on the map, you can see how this price would be divided between different sea areas in Finland. Finally, about the national plan in Finland. So as we have already heard, the national plans for the EU nature restoration law should be ready in the summer of 26, and Finland has a plan to have the national plan ready for the 18th of August 26. Some preliminary work is already done on estimating the costs, what this whole thing would mean for Finland. Unfortunately, the report is only in Finnish and the table is in Finnish, but I've highlighted with red the part which is in relation to coastal lagoons. So there's calculations on what is the aerial coverage of these coastal lagoons in the Finnish coast and what is the aerial coverage that is in a poor condition and how much of this is on the Natura 2000 areas. And there we have a price estimate, which is about the 5,000 to 25,000 euros per site if we are talking about these coastal lagoon restorations. Talking about a lot here about the cost of these restorations, but also needing to remember the kind of benefits that we get manyfold once we've done these restorations, and particularly if we talk about coastal lagoons and fish, there's quite clear measurable benefits what we can see as improved fish stocks on the coastal waters and also direct benefits for commercial fisheries and food provisioning. Our partners on the biodiversity project, and I'll thank you and happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Excellent. And the questions we have, Sanna, specifically regarding the picture that you showed about and maybe I can invite our technical team to go back to the channels in the lagoons, the man-made. The question is, how long are these open channels expected to last before they need, again, management and a new restoration, and sort of when the active phase is done, when do you expect to go back and do it again?
This is a very good question, and this is something that I've wondered a lot myself also, and how do we need to think about this, not only if we talk about coastal lagoons, but also on different habitats. What are the timelines that we are talking about, that once we do restorations, is it like in 15, 20 years that we need to go back and do these things? And I think this is definitely a good point to think about throughout the process once we are also making the national plans, but also doing restorations and I don't have a direct answer to that in terms of land uplift. If we're talking about that is a bit variable. If we're talking about the southern part of Finland, it's slower process than in the middle part of the Bay of Bosnia. But certainly there are some times that we need to go back. Also remembering that, as I showed with the coastal lagoons, that it's part of the natural process in here that we lose some coastal lagoons at some point.
Exactly. Yeah, but I think the point is that it's reoccurring, right, and that directly probably affects the cost efficiency or the costs associated with the effort, right? So, excellent. I thank you very much for the presentation. And right now, for those online, we have reached the moment for our break. I will invite the technical team to add the timer for that, but we will come back shortly at 11:30. So we'll take a 10-minute break. So make sure that you take a cup of coffee or take a cup of water, stand up, move around a bit, and we meet back in 10 minutes right here, and we continue with presentations and also the panel discussion. One quick reminder, please make sure that you write your questions, comments, and insights in the questionnaire and chat, so we can use them for the panel discussion right after the presentation and the break. So we see you in 10 minutes. Thank you. Hi, and welcome back. We're back from the break, and we will continue with our agenda. On the menu, we have one presentation, and then after that, we'll have a panel discussion. We'll use the questions from the audience in the panel discussion, so feel free to add in the chat your input, your insight, and your comments and questions, so we can use them for the panel. But before the panel, we'll continue with a presentation about active restoration of marine habitats in Denmark, and the presenter will be Federica Montesanto from Aarhus University. Federica, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me, and thank you, HELCOM, for organizing this. And I am Federica Montesanto. I'm here on behalf of the Aarhus Department and the Professor Peter Steyer and Karsten Dahl, but also from the Danish Center for Marine Restoration. And that is a consortium of different universities in Denmark, but also of a council of municipalities. Because as we say, the awareness is very important in this kind of projects, and in Denmark is very present. So first of all, I want to introduce which habitats call for marine restoration in Denmark. And these are different ones. We have 4 fjords and shallow habitats that were lost for land reclamation. We have boulder reef. They were actually fished and removed in order to do construction and buildings, and then biogenic reef that were targeted or collateral damage by fisheries, and then eelgrass beds that of course are very challenged habitats by eutrophication, pollution and physical damage. And with a general estimate of the average loss of these environments in Denmark, we have that for fjords and inlets we lost something like 400 square kilometers, something a lot bigger for eelgrass beds, smaller for boulder reefs, and for biogenic reef is even not possible to estimate, but we know that the loss is profound. And the first habitat restoration project that I want to talk about today, it is the first ULife marine project that was funded in 2017 and until 2012. And this is the Blue Reef project. So we are talking about this island that is called to the Lazo Island. It is in the north of Denmark, and this was a Natura 2000 reef site. It was degraded, we didn't have enough biodiversity, so at some point it was this decision to restore the reef using something like 100,000 tons of boulders. And what we did was a baseline study and then an effect study, so a post-monitoring study after something like 6 years. And what we saw is that this higher, taller graph on the right side is that the biodiversity increase during the years compared to the baseline study was something like 4 or 5 times the baseline study. And what also we saw, it is, we did a quick estimate of the different part, as we saw before for the other projects, of what was the main part of cost of this project. And as you can see, the bigger chunk, that is the blue chunk, was the post-monitoring part. The post-monitoring part is a very important part, especially when we want to talk about the cost effectiveness of this kind of projects. And then we have something that is also very important, is the dissemination and the awareness in the publics and in the stakeholders. And then what I want to show you is a little bit about the major activities that we are doing in Denmark. And I want to show you, this is a very nice site that was promoted by the Center of Marine Natural Restoration in Denmark, where we collect all the different kind of marine restoration projects that are undergoing and were in the past in Denmark. And if you click on the different part of the map, you can see some of the main outcomes of these marine restoration projects. And making a little bit of the synthesis and a summary of the marine restoration project from the early 2000s to nowadays in Denmark, we see a growing interest and number of projects that are from the different capital habitats, but also we see something that is more going through as something that we call a seascape restoration, so not targeting one single habitat, but more than one. And also we can see the area that is actually growing, the area being restored for each habitat. And another thing that was very interesting was to see the funding, so the interest in the money invested for this kind of habitats. And then we wanted to compare a little bit of what is being invested in buildings and construction in the sea. As you can see, there is a growing investment in active marine restoration, and the cost of marine restoration might vary a lot depending on the habitat, but also this is always considerably lower compared to the investment of what we are actually putting in the sea for other kind of activities, anthropic activities. And then I was talking about the seascape restoration. So talking about the main restored habitat in Denmark, we have eelgrass and boulder reef and biogenic reef. What if we actually do something like putting all together of course, in the location that allow us to do that. And so we have different ecosystem services from each one that can be nursery or fishery spillover, for example, for birders. And then we have wave attenuation, coastal protection, or carbon and nutrient storage if we talk about eelgrass beds. And so we want to apply this concept to a really interesting area that is the Sandvale fjord, putting all together this kind of active restoration. So we put the boulder reef, biogenic reef, and eelgrass. And this project is still ongoing. We are doing the monitoring part, and for the monitoring we have a important chunk of costs, and then we have a very important part that is actually devolved for the marine restoration, and also the marine restoration on the proper habitats, but also something that might be called something like passive restoration, for example, with the removal of green crabs that are predators of eelgrass, and especially for the roots and the seed of eelgrass. And this is also an important part that should be included in our cost effectiveness estimation. And then I want to show you some guidelines and tools that in Denmark we are developing. So there is the Danish Coastal Authority published a document for guiding the stakeholders and the municipalities that want to act for restoration projects. And then for as a Danish Center of Marine Restoration, we have some guidelines on how to monitor, how to put out boulders and eelgrass. And then also a really important part is the site selection. So we developed a GIS tool to select the best suitable areas, for example, where you can put out boulders or eelgrass, depending on different physical suitability or presence, so historical presence of different habitats, such as eelgrass or boulder reef, and then combining all these layers, finding a final combined suitability. So we have different areas which are the one that will be more suitable for active restoration, depending on the different physical, historical, and kind of conflict and synergies that we can have in different areas. And then we are developing a questionnaire for stakeholders and practitioners of marine restored areas to also have a feeling of what they feel is a success, is a cost of effectiveness for the people that are actually active in this field. And then we have a kind of developed a decision wheel. So it's very important, as we saw also with the other presenter, to know that active restoration and passive restoration have to go hand in hand. So maybe we have a site that is not exactly suitable for active restoration, but can we implement passive restoration, remove some kind of stressors and anthropic pressure, and then maybe the same site can be then suitable for active restoration, which kind of active restoration, and then implement always short-term and long-term monitoring. Because of course, when you apply some kind of short-term monitoring, we can see the biodiversity can increase. And when we talk, for example, with boulder reef, we know that this is kind of easy. But then we have in the long term the function, the food webs are actually restored. This is also important and more tricky to understand in this kind of monitoring, and it needs more expertise and for sure more money. And so I want to say something that I think needs a little more attention in this big marine restoration topic. So then we are doing this marine restoration project, and they are already asking for us how to upscale it. And I think there's something that could be very important is that to have some monitoring guideline, and it's important to have before and after control monitoring approaching. And then also which kind of indicators are more important to quantify the restoration success, so the ecosystem services are gained and when, and how to put money on this, how to elaborate the cost efficiency. And then it can be important to target one or more habitats. And then I conclude that we, in Denmark, we have multiple projects that are funded by Europe, or also the other kind of foundation that are private foundation, and the Ministry of Environment and National Parks. And then we have also a Marine Nature Fund that will start from this year in the next 6 years. And this is an important fund, and so what we want to be is to be ready to actually have something that is the most cost-effective as possible to have a good success in our marine restoration projects. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Federica. I will move here. Now we'll take a short setup technical break. We have a short video to show you, and then we'll set up the panel and we continue with the panel discussion. Feel free to write your remarks and comments in the chat so we can use them for the panel discussion. So a couple of seconds and we continue with the panel. we are back in the panel, a very quick setup, and we suddenly appear us all. We have Laura, one of the presenters here, Sanna and Federica, and also Lisa Saikonen has joined us. Lisa is a senior researcher and environmental economist at the Finnish Environmental Institute. So we continue with the panel discussion. We have several questions from the audience, but I think it's important that we start with, we use the word cost efficient. We saw also on several slides that we can see that we can measure several things. We can see the costs, we can see maybe the outcomes and the outputs of the efforts and the measures that have been taken. But then overall cost efficient is almost a binary word, right? It is either it is cost efficient or it's not, or maybe it's not binary. I will let you elaborate on that. But my question is, how do we define that, or how can we agree on, okay, this is the line and this is the border of cost efficiency, and this is a bit sort of over that, and so on? Because if it's two, we can measure, and then we can say one is different than other, and so on. So what are your thoughts on that? How do you define, or what is the correct way, how to define cost efficiency level in this context?
Okay, well, in my perspective, I come from the environmental economics background and sort of optimization perspective. You have to look at all the possible management options, including all the measures, and then to come up with the best possible set of measures to reach the cost-efficient outcome. And you also have to look at the joint impacts between the measures. So one measure could affect the impact of another measure, and therefore it's a very complicated process, I think.
Yes, well, it's certainly not easy, I didn't mention maybe in my presentation, but just if we're just looking at one habitat and as like, for example, coastal lagoons, even within those, not all the same methods apply to all of them, or you need to kind of have site-specific methods in place, and that already brings you a wide range of costs that it could be. Also kind of one of the things that is affecting the costs quite a lot is like who is doing it. We might have some sort of nature associations or sometimes even volunteering work, and actually in then you might actually have a very cost benefit cases, but then again kind of with more of a kind of research institute perspective, you might have the higher end of the costs when you're doing this. I really liked the kind of what Federica was showing in her presentation about these kind of how we can maybe try to think as much as possible to look at how we can bring different restoration measures in one location and try to combine efforts, and not only just of kind of restoration methods, but also bringing as much as possible different organizations or different projects together, try to find some sort of cooperative manner to do these things. And I think those could be also the ways to bring the costs down and get more out of these things.
And also another thing that I think is important is also the time that we are talking about. So if we talk about short-term effects, short-term cost, or we are talking about long-term. So this in the long term is more difficult to measure. There is more expertise that is needed to actually understand, and then we need more time, I think, because at least for the Denmark projects, we are in the meanwhile in the estimating this cost. So and the new project with the having multiple habitats at the same time, they are undergoing now. So will we have the effects maybe in 10 years documented in a certain way? So also this might be a part that we have to consider.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really great points. I think the only thing that I would add to that is I think we also need to understand what we're comparing to. to know if, obviously we're assuming that the restoration is effective. We've achieved the desired outcome, but if it's cost effective, is it cost effective in comparison to what? To other methods that we've tried, or in comparison to the benefits that are gained, or both? And if we're looking at benefits, should we think in the long term about avoided loss or avoided cost as well? I think there's really a lot to unpack and really understand the intangible benefits that are associated with restored, intact ecosystems now and in the future. So it's obviously not a very super simple question.
No.
It's deceptively simple question.
It sounds simple until you try to sort of define it and you hear yourself answering it, right? Because it untangles a lot of things. While you were talking, I was thinking also it depends also how different people or different parties approach it. Politicians might say cost efficient is cheap. Other people might say cost efficient is it doesn't matter how much it costs as long as we get the desired outcome. Then again, it might be also the output. As long as if we do some sort of restoration measure, then we fix it. Okay, after a week we have done that, we have reached that, it now works. But as you mentioned, you prolong the time, you prolong the period, and then suddenly monitoring costs come in, reoccurring efforts come in, and so on. Can you elaborate on what are because we have different countries represented, and you talk to other stakeholders in other countries quite much. What are the key reasons of the cost difference? What creates the difference in cost going from Svalbard to Finland to Denmark, maybe also in Baltics? What are the key elements that drive up or down the cost of these measures?
Well, I think, or should I start? Okay.
Yeah, feel free.
Well, what it comes to Finland, we have very unique land ownership structure, and a lot of the sea areas close to the coast are owned by private people and coalitions of people. So it's very difficult and costly and timely to implement these restoration measures, because they also sort of cause trade-offs to the owners, and they might not want to implement those measures. And
so is it like the cooperation with them, or is it the actual some, I don't know, compensations or something that
probably
that
also
comes
compensation, and how it is informed, and how they maybe, I don't know if teach is the right word, but telling them about the issue, and maybe
raise
Sanna
the
knows
awareness.
more. But yeah.
Well, certainly, yeah, that is one part of it that does raise the costs in Finland, and as I mentioned on my talk, is that the time spent before the actual active restoration is also quite costly, and one part certainly is this land and water ownership that we have here, and just by kind of locating these people, getting in touch with them, talking them about what this restoration is, and also talking about the benefits that it would bring, is certainly kind of time consuming, and also then we are talking about money in there. But all in all, I think, as I mentioned, with the cost, it's very difficult to focus on one number, but even just within one habitat, as I mentioned, we are talking about like some sort of price range that we need to talk about. And then also, if we think about the efficiency, like how do you measure the efficiency? Maybe in terms of like the fish, it might be to some extent a bit more simple when you can actually measure, especially in terms of coastal lagoons. You can see the situation before, then you have the restoration, and then you can see the after restoration effects, and in many cases we can see quite rapid positive responses in terms of increased fish production, and that's something that we can measure, and also we can kind of draw some conclusions on the local commercial fisheries of the catches that they get, and you can put some sort of a price tag on that. But I think it might be more difficult in terms of some of the other kind of species specific restorations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, indeed, I want to talk, for example, about Denmark, that we have these very shallow fjords with a lot of like agriculture and wastewater affecting them. So when we are restoring, we put out mussels and eelgrass, and we want to actually have, for example, a better water quality. And not always is so easy and measurable. And another thing that can be actually lower the cost is the fact that in Denmark we have a lot of awareness, and so we have municipalities that actually they gather each other, and the citizens that they go out and they sample. So these can lower the cost, but also they need the tools. So they actually, it is also very good that they ask the university to give some tools. And what we are trying to do is to give to develop the cheapest tool and also sometimes, like, let's say, the easiest way to do that also for someone that is not a scientist. But also that I think is important to define and should be more on a, let's say, common effort to decide what is the minimal effort, the minimal of the sampling that actually allows us to have useful data to understand where we are going, if we are going in the right direction.
Standardized data. This is something else that's important, so we can compare from one site to another, sites of different size, different type, maybe similar ecosystems in slightly different environments, to understand how effective our restoration efforts have been. But
yeah, I'm just curious, in your project you had different sites. Have you compared any of the costs, like, between the sites that you have?
we're working on it, but it's not really, it's sort of apples to oranges comparisons, because they're very different. We're looking at soft bottom ecosystems versus shallow rocky areas, and seagrass beds. They're very different, and the costs associated with the restoration of each type is different. In Svalbard, we have the added costs of logistics. Simply because it's remote, and then there's times of the year when it's not very accessible. So you could see in the information I presented that there was a lot of cost associated with preparing things and getting ready to do things, and shipping samples and shipping equipment, things like that. And I think we all know that with marine, it's not marine restoration. It's not as simple as, say, going out and sampling a soil core. It's quite a bit more involved and more costly. But it's important that we have that data. What we saw was that a lot of our costs were, in fact, the bulk of our costs were associated with establishing that baseline. But it's absolutely critical to know what the baseline is, so that we know if we've been effective. And we can't know if it's been cost effective without knowing what we're aiming for to start with. So although it seems very costly, it was absolutely essential, and it will pay off.
Yeah. It's the data above all. You mentioned the standardization of data and a sort of common understanding of it, and using the same sort of input to create some either decisions or make those decisions. But it comes to my mind that a Lego brick, this ordinary Lego brick 2x4 with these little pieces that it connects together, if you have 6 of them, you can put together them in almost 1 billion different unique combinations. And I see your face, Laura, and you're surprised. And I usually use this sort of association with that, even if we have some data, or we say that we measure the same thing, or we do the same thing, it could be also these different Lego bricks who tend to be similar or almost the same, but when we start putting things together, every one of us can have hundreds of different variations and uniqueness. How do we overcome that? What are the prerequisites that we need in this context to not create almost 1 billion different understandings from the same standardized data, if we can get that? I know it's a bit of sort of...
Well, the first thing coming to my mind, I think, throughout this process, if you call it like that, that we are looking from here to future, is that there would be a dialogue between different projects, countries. If we're talking about HELCOM, we are talking about the Nordic Council of Ministries, we're talking about EU. I think it is really key that we keep the kind of dialogue going, and as Laura was speaking, I was thinking also like that would it also be beneficial that we have, because it is difficult to compare apples and oranges, but if we talk about seagrass beds and they have something in common throughout Europe. If we're talking about coastal lagoons, they have similarities. So I think maybe there's also more kind of like focused discussions on certain habitats that we need to have and compare the nodes best methods, monitoring methods, and everything within those. And I think just and it's not just about the cost, but just the kind of or the how you build the Lego bricks. But I think it is really vital throughout all this that knowledge is shared.
Yeah.
I think it's also very important to collect the cost information systematically, not just the ecological information, but also like have a systematic approach how to define the costs of different measures, because I've seen so many ways to do that. So.
It sounds almost like we've designed a new project.
Yeah.
Establishing a consolidated evidence base that brings together all of the ecological and economic, socio-economic knowledge that we have to kind of overcome this anecdotal piecemeal nature. So that we can make these comparisons and maybe even use some of the same methodologies where possible or where appropriate, so that we're measuring the same things the same way, and we can compare, say, these different types of seagrass beds or different oyster production, for example. I think we've written our next project.
Can at least can we agree on that? I see there's a question about the actual economic value of the ecosystem is at the base of all of this discussion, right? But then the question is, how can the value of a single location be estimated before assessing the cost effectiveness of the measures that we take? So how do we define the value of the things that we want to protect? What are your maybe general assumptions and definitions of it, but maybe you have a very specific, concrete evidence on how it is done in your organizations.
I think we can use market data, for example, on like existing market data on, for example, carbon emission prices, or for the benefits from carbon sequestration, for example. But then there are, of course, these more difficult benefits, these like recreational values and maybe like existent values and such, which are kind of difficult. We have valuation methods for those, but then to transfer the benefits from one location to another is very difficult. And of course, there's a lot of vagueness and ambiguity in those. So.
Yeah, and for example, there are some areas that maybe you do something located and then you have a spillover effect, for example, in fisheries. Yeah. So, and it's very different if you have some outcome from fisheries or something like just recreational, for example. So it doesn't mean that it's less important, but we have to consider multiple aspects. Yeah.
In the work that I presented, we've been working closely with stakeholders to identify what they value. And to understand how the value is what it means to us, and it's not measured in any consistent way. If we look through the literature, we could think about willingness to pay versus intrinsic value, modeled values. So we've been talking with the local stakeholders about ecosystem services, nature's contributions to people, and trying to identify very specifically in this location and in this ecosystem and this socio-ecological system, what do you value? what are the most important things to you to maintain, restore, protect, conserve, and how then do we place a value on it in our own models to understand what is cost effective?
But then how do we deal with that I value that I can take my motorboat very easily to out of the lagoon? And how do we sort of, because there is some sort of intrinsic value discussion, right? What is right and what is wrong? And then it's not just about those stakeholders. So maybe in your experience, how do you tackle that? How do you deal with the people who are involved in this, but their values maybe don't, like the compass is slightly different from the north that we all have.
Well, if I think about this my example of coastal lagoons and fish, well, first of all, kind of like to the previous question, I think that is one fairly simple way of measuring the before and after and the benefits. And what we've seen, for example, in our project is that when we are talking to people locally and the land and water owners, many times with this fish perspective, people are getting maybe a bit more easier on board with things because they can see directly the benefit also to themselves. If we talk about that we can increase the local fish stocks and you like to go fishing, they can see the direct benefit that actually this is a good idea. However, there are these problems that we are facing is particularly with these cases, as you mentioned, these boating, that they might actually value their boating abilities stronger than the fish. And as mentioned, this land and water ownership in Finland, the person has quite a lot of power to say that I don't want this to happen in the waters that I own, and case closed.
And also it's the involvement of community, right? And also raising awareness and education and also involving them. I was thinking also, do you have in your experience involvement of the local community does that effort drive the cost up or down? Because in some presentations I saw also plus volunteer work, right? People are involved, people are engaged, they want to help, they want to contribute to the overall target, but then it'd be also quite expensive to educate them, raise awareness, communicate all the different things and so on. So in your experience, is it the zero-sum sort of plus and minus equals, or it's more driving the cost up or down? Maybe you can.
From my perspective, I think we need to look at it as more than just balancing the books. It's not all how much have we invested in the community versus how much are we getting. It's about building knowledge and social capacity for the long-term success of these restoration projects and similar work. That we're focused on living more sustainably, or in having a nature positive development of our communities. So any investment that we make should, at least in theory, but I think we've also seen evidence that it pays off multiple times what we've invested in it. Not only directly through citizen or community engagement in, say, monitoring and assessment activities, but simply to catalyze new actions. The community comes up with ideas as well. This isn't something that is coming top down or from the scientific community. We're there to support, really.
Yeah. At this point, something that is very funny and nice that is happening in Denmark, for example, there are some communities and there are boat owners that they ask us, we want to go out, do you want to come with us? And just, we dive together and so it's like we are actually taking advantage of them, because sometimes we don't have a boat there and they want just to have fun out there, and they've also like a reason to go. Sometimes are retired people and they want to see more fish, and they like to see, they have the knowledge how it was before, and they are seeing some action, and so we go together together, and we are having, I don't know how much we are gaining or they are gaining, but I think that there is a very good collaboration.
The networking and collaboration effort. Yeah.
Definitely, and I can see that also in Finland. Like just as two examples, is that again on the fish side of things, but these regional fishing areas, they have a lot of people who are, for example, kind of pinpointing to us locations that they think that could actually fit for restoration, and they are willing to kind of put their time and effort on helping. But also, like if I think about like the seagrass beds, we also have like divers associations that are very keen on taking part and you know, having the expensive boat time and also doing the diving and planting the seagrass. So I think there's a lot of this kind of willingness and as we've already seen previously with, if we're talking about migratory fish and rivers, it's been really kind of popular for people to take part on these active restorations. People are almost like queuing when, you know, they open up the kind of registration for these actions. People are really keen on doing something with their own hands and seeing that they're doing something good. And what I was also thinking when Laura was talking is that I think along with this process that we are all working on restoring the nature, I think it would be very good to have a really strong emphasis also on the communication and how do we communicate this to the wider public in a Europe context, in national context, because I think we really need everybody on board on this. And people are not getting on board unless they don't understand what it is and what are the benefits for them. So I think it would be actually very beneficial that we all, at the same time, we continuously think about like, how do we communicate this in such a way? Because at least if I think about in Finland, when this EU nature restoration law was planned, and there was a lot of talk in the public and in the media and newspapers about how expensive this is going to be. And I think that got quite a lot of emphasis that this is just going to be very costly. And not so much was on the focus of what is at stake, what are the benefits, how this is actually bringing something for all of us. And I think we really would need to put much more effort on communicating.
Yeah, I agree with you all. That's like my question. How do you define the community? Is it just those people who live close to the sea and are active users, or like, for example, for Finland, all the citizens who live in Finland pay taxes, which are then used for marine restoration? So maybe we should focus on maybe a more wider audience, or yeah.
On that note, this is one of the reasons we've engaged the tourist sector, tourists themselves, and the travel and tourism sector in Svalbard. But also coming back to how we communicate and how we engage in Madeira, which I didn't talk about today, but that we've engaged the diving companies and divers in helping with the surveys for sea urchins. So people love to record observations and photos, and it's very easy to use an app, but they're also at the same time contributing to scientific research while having fun. So it doesn't have to be like going to school. It's a great time, and they get to share knowledge and learn something coincidentally. So I think it's a fantastic way to engage community members, and there's lots of different similar ways that we can get involved in monitoring and assessment and providing baseline data.
Yeah, and on that note, I think that would be also very good. And it's something that at least in Denmark we have still to develop. Is like okay, when all these people, because in some places like Australia, they take photos, whatever, and then there is a baseline, there is a platform, like just put it in there so everybody can benefit and can have it from there. Do you have something similar in your project?
Well, in Madeira, they've developed the app that,
very good.
so all the diving companies are involved, and they distribute it to the I guess the customers who then upload it to a common place, and it's kept stored there in a database.
Excellent. There's a question regarding the pairing of restoration and pressure reductions. Several of the presentations mentioned this pairing restoration with pressure reductions. How well does the cost-effective restoration discussion include the efforts of pressure reduction and passive restoration? How would you elaborate on that?
Well, at least regarding Denmark, not always is included, unfortunately, because we look a lot of like which habitats we want to come back, what the fish, and then sometimes like in the fjord, the last example that I would then. Afterwards, we realize, but here there are green crabs, so it's very difficult to transplant eelgrass because they eat it. They are big predators. So then you have the passive restoration. So you implement a new project to, I think it will be very important to reduce before, and but it's not easy to implement. I think,
Yeah, and I'm thinking kind of like on a Baltic-wide. View, and I think in terms of like passive restoration, I think the minimizing the eutrophication is really the key if we're talking about the Baltic Sea. Many of these things that we are doing, they are not very long-lasting results unless we are tackling the eutrophication load at the same time. To some extent, it can be a bit of a plaster, putting a small plaster somewhere kind of effect, unless we are dealing with the really big nutrient loads that these habitats are facing. So I really would kind of put effort on that. Also kind of like, I think together with these, I think we can think about the process of course there's like fishing methods and maybe like in together with like doing these active restorations, for example, in the lagoons, you can think about limiting fisheries on at least on a certain time period, like the spawning time. Like at that time, the fishing is restricted, because why do we restore the place for spawning fish if the people then come and fish the fish, and then so and then also kind of thinking about at the same time the targets that we have, that by 2030 we have the 30% marine protected area coverage. How do we kind of look at that at the same time when we are doing these active restorations? Is there some ways that we can combine these? Where are the key areas, and these kind of also a bit of a marine spatial planning in terms of like where are the key habitats and restored places, and how can we strengthen those efforts?
For me, the passive restoration was completely new term. I've never heard it before, but I don't know.
There is, if I may just jump in with a specific question, what time frame might exist for the passive restoration of the dredged openings from your presentations, Anna?
Well, yes, this was a very good question, well, this is very Finland specific, and as I mentioned, we have this land uplift process that naturally we are losing these lagoons for the land uplift, but we need to somehow be able to separate what is the natural process and what is the effects of eutrophication that we see in terms of if we have this eutrophication load that we are not minimizing, we can talk about just a couple of years that these things will outgrow again, and then we have the same issue. I think this also kind of links, in my mind at least, to the kind of broader perspective of what is the timeline if we are restoring, whether to be seagrass beds or it's lagoons or it's whatnot, like what is the timeline that we need to kind of see these things again? The environment is constantly changing, as we know. Then what is do we have like lines when do we need to go back and see what's happening? Is this a bit of a process like in a marine strategy framework directive? It has this kind of cycle that we go back and we see what is the status, and we adjust and then we act again and so on. So this is a really good question that I think we need to kind of think throughout this.
Is there a right answer for this? Can we agree here? Decide?
I would like to make the point, I don't think it has to be an either or situation that you either have passive restoration or active restoration. And in fact, anything we can do to reduce the pressure on an ecosystem will help with any restoration effort, whether we're looking at natural attenuation as the process that's going to take over and we're allowing the ecosystem to recover on its own, or if we are then actively going in and restoring aspects. But if we can reduce anthropogenic pressure, it's always going to be helpful, useful. So I think it's not an either or question.
I guess the question is that it will be useful, but at what cost, right? And then there's always the argument of, yes, and I have a friend, he's not the smartest friend that I have, but he has this saying that nature takes its course. Whenever he doesn't want to do something or something wrong happens, he says like, well, nature will take care of itself and so on. And maybe that's also sometimes a counter-argument of all the efforts, right? Saying that, yes, it's not okay to actively do harm, but maybe it's not necessarily to actively do some good there. And how do we tackle that?
Well, this is something that I think we all learn about in ecology, this idea of natural attenuation, that if a system is not disturbed to the extent that it's unable to recover, that eventually it will reach an equilibrium, it will come back to function. I think the question is, how quickly do we want our ecosystems restored? To what extent, and to what extent have we degraded them? Have human anthropogenic activity. We also need to consider at the same time as we've had anthropogenic impacts on our ecosystems, the change in climate is having a really profound impact on biodiversity, ecosystem integrity, and we need to probably put more effort into restoring, given those ongoing changes.
I think it comes to my mind a saying in the United States to say we don't need to save the planet for the planet's sake, we need to save the planet for people's sake. And I think it's the same thing for us. The sea itself will deal with us. The question is how good we will feel living in ecosystem together with the sea. But if we continue with this conversation with giving with one hand and taking away with another, are there any more? You mentioned one, but any more examples that it can make economical sense to pursue restoration measures prior to stopping the activities that in the first place caused the environment stress or destruction? So, because you mentioned it's like, yes, we should sort of start with eliminating the cause, but then again, you can't necessarily always do that to perfect sense and then start. So it's probably something we do simultaneously. Question is about the economic sense, if you will.
Well, I think we get a lot of economic benefits or ecosystem services from nature, and then by doing restoration, we improve the ecosystem's ability to provide those services. And then also, if we don't do anything now, then it's probably much more costly to do it later. So, yeah.
We do depend on the healthy nature, healthy environment. Our existence is dependent on that. There's benefits.
Or it's a necessity, otherwise we don't exist.
Yeah, and I was showing that we are, at least in Denmark, there is like the investment in construction, seaport construction is like 10,000 more. And then you see that we are putting some effort, more money on restoring the habitat that we are actually putting out. And so maybe at least having like the political and the government like have this in mind, like how we can, balance a little bit and.
Yeah. I was thinking when you asked the question, to what extent are we always restoring to 100% in our very, very disturbed ecosystems? So I think we can all agree that we're not going to remove major port infrastructure, our transport routes. So if we consider that we won't eliminate that infrastructure, we're not going to eliminate that use, yet we still want to restore the ecological function, then of course we still want to undertake restoration activities while we're continuing to anthropogenically affect that ecosystem. So I think it's probably very site dependent.
If we continue the discussion about the time frame and the timeline and where, because it is an ongoing process, it is a cycle, if you will. The question is, how do you ensure the afterlife of restoration efforts? So what happens after the restoration efforts, after the project ends? Because that's a clear output, right? We have a project, we have a specific target, we have a specific budget and time frame and everything, and then on 1st of December we say the project is done. So what happens, what's the afterlife that if we're not engaging the locals, the stakeholders? Because it could be that we go there, we do something, and then you say, okay, this is now the local people, sort of, it's on them. So is engagement aspects, or engagement of those stakeholders aspects included in the restoration law framework? So that's probably the question more about the EU restoration law. But in your sort of, how do we give a chance for a consecutive work on those sites that we're working for after we have a limited project end?
Of course, I think there's largely about funding. How do we fund the future? As you say, we can have Horizon project, we can have Life projects, but these always have a lifespan of 5 to maximum 8 years. And at the moment, we are working with the kind of idea that we do the restorations, we try to be cost efficient, we try to do the monitoring, see that we have actually got the results that we were hoping for. But then in the end, we are kind of almost lifting our hands up and saying like, well, now let's hope for the best. And then this also links to the question about the kind of the time, like how do we monitor that in the future? But then the monitoring doesn't happen if we don't have some sort of funding in place. And as we previously talked about, a lot of these kind of volunteering work and what's or not, that's great. And I think that is a really good part to involve people while we are on the active restoration phase of things. But for securing that what we put money for the restoration would be cost efficient, we do need to have some sort of monitoring, longer term funding that we can follow up.
Yeah, it would be great to have it at a European level, like having a fund that was like just putting apart from this kind of, because otherwise we cannot really talk about cost effectiveness.
I think we see this a lot in our work. Is we come in with a project, say an EU project or a nationally funded project, and everything is great for 5 to 8 years, like you say. But when we're finished, there's very little funding remaining for this, the ongoing monitoring, maintenance, the governance. So here we come into the question of top-down versus bottom-up actions, and I think that the long-term success depends a lot on whether we are imposing something from a top-down or we are engaging with local communities and seeking to add value and improve, support these bottom-up actions that align with these overall goals. And I think there we're likely to see a lot more long-term commitment. And it takes a lot of effort to maintain a site and to maintain monitoring. So I think this is a really big question. Who does it and how do we ensure that it's done? And I think, as you were saying, having some sort of funding in place, like higher level program that would fund local actions to maintain and monitor effectiveness would be really good.
It is a good question, and let's try to answer it. Let's play a little game, because I see there's another question. How do you propose to ensure restoration measures are lasting long enough? And going into feeding into this conversation we just had, if you have a 1-2 specific things, you'd say, okay, we need to have this, and I will use up funding and capacity. Those two words are already taken and let's say they're given. But how do we use the capacity and the funding if we have that? What are the specific things we need to do to ensure that the restoration efforts are sort of in effect long enough for them to create the benefit?
I don't know if we have the funding, then I don't. Do we have a problem?
But where do we
then?
spend the money?
Okay.
We have the money. Here's a bag of money.
Maybe
Where do we spend
we
it?
need some kind of funding that's not maybe dependent on the current government, or I don't know.
So it's out of government controlled
well, it's
funding.
sometimes a political process, and maybe it changes between the governments. And
So stable funding could be the
stable
the
funding.
thing to
Yeah.
have. Okay. So we have stable funding. Where do you spend that money?
Well, I also maybe think that which was mentioned earlier, but I think collaborative efforts would probably help as well. Like if we have locations like you showed the example of in Denmark, where we can have different kind of restoration measures. Of course, that doesn't happen everywhere. That's suits in certain places. Of course, we have so many different kind of types of restorations that is happening. But if we can already kind of have that collaborative effort going through, I think that can also kind of be beneficial in terms of like in the longer term, that we can see that these places are in a good state, healthy state for longer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I will also implement like the monitoring, since we have this money. When we talk about monitoring, we do like a biodiversity monitoring, we do sampling, collection, but then also see like the function of the ecosystem, see the food web, how is this ecosystem enriched, what are the different, if we're talking about seascape restoration, we have different habitat, what is giving from the different habitat, how we can enhance that and upscale, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So money is no object in this scenario.
No,
So
let's imagine that for a second.
So in addition to what all of you have mentioned, I think it is important to understand what impacts or what future scenarios we might see. So how are climate change and development likely to affect this ecosystem? Are we restoring it to what it was today or 5 years ago or 10 years ago? Or are we trying to continually restore with the idea that we have successional planning in mind to maintain integrity in the face of changing climate? So I think species distribution modeling and climate modeling go hand in hand with understanding impacts, current impacts, future scenarios. And also I would think that we need to consider development planning. So what's the vision that the local community have for the development of that community, and how does that go hand in hand with the ecological systems?
Mm-hmm. So keeping in mind, sort of thinking about the future, not only sort of in retrospect and reactive, but also sort of proactively dealing with the things that's in front of us. If we move towards, we're talking about the cost. Let's talk about the other part of it, the benefit part. There's a question from the audience regarding restoration of different habitat types can have different overall ecosystem benefits. For example, knockoff effects, functions, resilience. How are these wider ecosystem benefits considered in restoration cost-effectiveness prioritization? So how do we involve those overspilling benefits that Federica, you mentioned previously?
Yeah, exactly. And also this is important how we monitor, because when we monitor in different ways, and then they have also different time. Sometimes when you put like a muscle for example, you are more filtration of water quality, and then maybe you have to put them in place in different time scale, for example. So first you put the mussel and then the boulders, and then you monitor in a different ways depending on what you want from the different habitats to have. So I think that it is more complex for sure, maybe more difficult to achieve for some reason, for some aspects, but then I think that the effectiveness that you will have and the function and the resilience that you have finally from the ecosystem will build a more resilient ecosystem, so it will be worth after all.
Any other thoughts?
Maybe the benefits or the ecosystem services could be already taken into account when defining the cost-effective sets of measures. instead of just looking at how do we achieve these policy goals. Or so maybe we should look at wider impacts of the policies.
So, any other inputs?
I think Lisa was kind of saying the similar kind of thoughts that I had in my mind, with the ecosystem services.
So if we think about the measures, because we have experience already, we have done at least each to your own analysis of things that work and things that work but takes much more capacity, effort, financial means, and so on. What measures are that, if you need to propose, okay, in our experience with the things that we have already done, we feel and we know almost that these measures are cost effective in the way that we conduct them? Because I completely agree that it could be that I could do the same thing somewhere else, but do it very differently in the sense that I don't reach the same cost-effective results. But with your experience with existing projects, which measures are cost-effective in your opinion? So, because there are people also in the audience asking, it's like, is this list, are these measures exhaustive? Is this the right answer? We want to hear the right answer. What measures are cost-effective? So if you need to propose that, having this little, what's it called, the little star there, that it might depend on your location and execution, but your experience. Cost-effective measures.
Well, I'll take us back to the fishery or fish world. I think, as I showed the one example of this kind of dredged channel, as cheaply as you think about, like a couple of thousands of euros, you can restore a channel, and that can have very quick responses, even within just depending, of course, of what time you do it, but kind of like just in a couple of months, you can actually see the direct benefits that, okay, now the conditions are such that the fish actually are finding this location to spawn. Also, I was thinking kind of we have these targets of freeing rivers in Europe. Is it 25,000 kilometers of rivers that needs to be freed up for also like migratory fish, and I think that maybe this methodologically it's very similar in many places. Are we talking about Finland and salmon or trout? We have lots of good examples from Finland, for example, of taking off dams that don't anymore serve the purpose that they used to have, and we can see quite rapid, positive nature kind of basically bouncing back, and fish returning very quickly. So we have really loads of kind of really encouraging and great examples from migratory fish and how they respond to these restoration measures.
Those are also good for increasing awareness, because people see the impacts. So it's not like some kind of hidden impact underwater or like.
Yeah, especially in Denmark, when we put out, for example, boulder reef, they are very great to increase biodiversity and to attract fish. And another thing that was very important is always to ban fishing in that area, at least for, 5-6 years when you are implementing the marine restoration. So they think that you are reducing at least one of the pressure. And then, because of course we have the pollution, the nutrient loss, but at least if you're banning the fishery pressure, you are actually improving the cost benefits of your action.
Mm-hmm. I think that the benefit of stakeholder co-creation cannot be overstated. We see tremendous benefit both in the short and long term. So in the short term, we have buy-in in terms of we've co-identified we've all agreed what the problem is to be solved. We've decided that we prioritize it. We've come up with a design. We're working together towards something, and so it becomes not someone doing it for, or coming in, some outsider coming in and doing something, but everyone coming together and building a common future. And in the long term, I think that that's the only thing that's going to sustain a lot of these really large projects, is that community sense of ownership.
But that community is also sort of on a state and country level, right? So do you see any synergies in working together in the Nordic region, apart from those obvious geographical ones where we have the imaginary border between each other. But yeah, could we achieve the objectives more efficiently by jointly optimizing the use of resources available, the information, the data available, capacity? Yeah, I have a driver, you have a boat. We could, yeah, but also in sort of in between countries. How do you see that kind of synergy?
I think it's hugely beneficial, and we already have some examples, for example, between Finland and Sweden in terms of talking about the in the Bay of Bothnia kind of very good cooperation between these countries, and very similar, of course, kind of landscape and environment. So I definitely encourage that also in the future.
Clearly, nature doesn't stop at a border. The fish don't reach a border and say, "Oh no," you know. So we should always be working hand in hand to ensure that we have, similar policies and practices, and that we're working towards the same goals. I think we can learn a lot from each other, and of course we can build on the successes too.
It's also important, like data sharing, like create some platform where everybody can put and it will be easier for the user from any country to just use the data and then work together.
How good are we at that right now? Because we have the opportunity to do that already, right? With the technology and everything. But then what usually happens with different data sources or different standards and so on, they say, yes, but they measure it slightly different. They have a different, oh, it's going to cost a lot of money to integrate our two databases and blah, 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 blah. There's always these sometimes made up and sometimes very objective complaints that, yes, I would love to use the data from Finland, but, right, and so on. So how good are you? 10 perfect, 1 terrible. How would you measure that in your personal experience? How easy it is for you to use data from other countries?
Well, my experience and I think the close operation on my perspective has been with Sweden and Finland, and I think cooperation has worked well, and of course it's about kind of like that we are talking about so similar locations, so you can kind of compare apples and apples and not something very, very different. But I can definitely see the kind of potential issues there, and throughout this, and I think highlighted it many times, but I think the communication also, like in the start, that we kind of we agree on things, that we talking about the same things in the start with. If we all start doing our own things, it's very difficult to connect the dots in a couple of years. But if we now kind of do the kind of groundwork and we make sure that we are talking as much as possible about the same things, it will also help us in the future.
So it's again the question of standardization.
It helps that we're all responding to European legislation, right? So regardless of whether we live in Finland or Sweden, we're trying to achieve the same sorts of targets. And so it's easier to standardize methods or practices. But we also face the challenge of the continuing evolution of the science. There's always new and better ways. We were talking about eDNA earlier and how this is applied, and the benefits and where we think it's going to be used or more. So we're always looking for the new best thing, and we all like to kind of put our brand on something. But I think we do need to come together more as a community and not only share our data in an online platform because we're supposed to, but try to seek a common platform and bring in as many standardized methods and standardized forms of data presentation as possible so that we can really maximize the value.
Because the framework is the same, right? The legal framework and so on. And see with the fishes who probably don't have passports at the passport control at the border are also the same. So we are slowly closing up to the end of our discussion. I will read through one of the questions or the last question that we have from the audience. I'm not sure which one of you is the best to answer, but feel free to answer all of you. In several cases, external restoration measures like nutrient limitation, emission limitations are not very effective for eutrophication. The question is, how much time do we have to wait and how much does it cost to wait? And as a follow-up, in such areas, how likely will a restoration effort be successful? Would it be done as a band-aid while the long-term eutrophication problem is being handled, or no?
Difficult
like
one, and I kind of maybe talked about that
Yeah,
a little bit
yeah,
earlier.
yeah.
That there's sometimes there can be a little bit of that kind of band-aid kind of feeling that we are doing very kind of specific spots that we are making these efforts, and yes, of course, everything helps towards the goal, but we do need to address the eutrophication if we're talking about the Baltic. Otherwise, where's the cost efficiency kind of with those smaller restoration efforts?
And align the measures with the Water Framework Directive and MSFD and
It's like doing a reparation in an apartment where there's a little fire or a big fire in the kitchen, right? And you're doing renovation in a different room.
I think it highlights the importance of taking a systems approach and understanding that we can't only address what's happening right at the point of impact, that we need to consider all the point sources and land-based impacts on marine environments. And this comes back to what you were talking about in your presentation, or I think both of you talked about in your presentation, non-point source pollution and the importance of addressing it at its source. So this is why we can't consider anything in isolation.
So to wrap up, if I can just ask every one of you to share one key takeaway that you yourself personally have from the conversation today, from the presentations that you have heard, and also one maybe if you see some low-hanging fruit or immediate action that we can share with our listeners and the audience, say, okay, this is something that, this is the next step, we should start there, or yeah. Lisa, if I can ask you to begin.
Thank you everyone for the interesting presentations, and I think what I learned is that the measures and the costs, they are very case specific. And also I learned a new term, passive restoration.
I think really the kind of like communicating these things throughout amongst us all who are working on the restorations, but also with the wider public, I think is really the key, that we get everybody on board. Also, I wanted to mention that this communication, there's also like on the ICES, they are working towards having a workshop in March on the restorations, and I encourage to look for that in March 25. And yes, I think just really the kind of maybe the communication is really the kind of take-home message.
Yeah. I would say yes, collaboration. Don't never think that every environment is just a closed space. We are talking about process. We are talking about things that change all the time. So always taking in mind that everything we are doing now, it's not that being just finished now, but we always have to take in mind and to actually improve this cycling process.
I think what was really highlighted for me is the opportunity that's presented by all the really excellent science. So I don't feel overwhelmed hearing about all the things that we need to do, but more inspired hearing about the great things that we are doing and the opportunities we have to collaborate and share knowledge, share data, processes, and try to work towards a common future, which has beautifully restored ecosystems everywhere.
Excellent. I thank you for the panel discussion and for the presentations. I invite you to keep your places here, and I will quickly move to wrap this up. We have had discussion and presentations about what and how to deal with marine restoration with efforts, and how to not only do the projects and work with the efforts, but also how to look at them from hindsight, if you will, to see the cost effectiveness of it, and to learn from these projects and these experiences, so we can create a better future decisions, better future processes that we have. I want to say a big thank you for the panelists, for the presenters, for the audience. We still have a couple of things we need to do. I think it's very important, and I don't want to say it too many times, but it's important to say it one too many than one too little time, that it's all about the communication, specifically when it comes to a cooperation between different stakeholders, not only between different countries, but also between different stakeholders on a level, intergovernmental, governmental, private, state communities, small communities somewhere in Svalbard, right? Big tourist masses that come there also, that they are individual, but as a whole. The stakeholder and co-creation effort cannot be understated, and it's very important to, because this is a complex problem, this is a complex process, and it is. When I was listening to the presentations and listening to the panelists talk, I understand that this is like a big yarn of wool that when you start to tangle, it seems very big and complex, and it is. But when you start untangling, it starts making sense, and it's just very important that all the involved parties are looking at the same yarn and understanding the same thing. As I mentioned about the example of Lego bricks, this is not the place where we can pretend that we understand each other when it comes to data, sharing the data. We need to know and be 100% sure that we all translate it correct. We don't need to make the same conclusions about the data. That's where the interpretation and communication happens. But we need to trust the information that we share with each other, and so-called objective truth about what is working and what is not working, and how do we translate that. So I invite you guys at home and everyone else to focus on these kind of things that we can compare the things that we share with each other, be it data, project results, outputs, outcomes, or whatever. And the value proposition of it is being defined by all the stakeholders involved in the context. Couple of remarks before we before we end up. I just want to mention, and Sanna already mentioned a part of it, but please, for the audience, make note that next year on March, from 4th to 7th of March, ICES workshop on nature restoration will be held at ICES headquarters in Copenhagen, but it will be also online, so similar setup to this. I asked the technical team to share the information and link in the chat. So those of you at home or at work or offices, please use the link to get more information and also to apply for that. And just to have a loop and to come back to the starting point where we started today at 10, I invited you to answer 3 questions about what do you understand with word restoration, what do you understand as the main challenges of that. And that input, it wasn't just for you to warm up or for you to spend time while you listen to the technical introduction or the welcoming speeches and so on. We have actually used that input and answers that you as audience members have provided for us. And we have, as I understand, and I'm looking for a nods in the technical team, thank you, that we have created the video, or we haven't, AI has created the video. We haven't done it ourselves, but it is an artificial intelligence model that has created the video based on the input that you guys provided. So I'm not sure if we are 100% ready to start. So after the video, we'll probably not come back to this to wrap up. So I want to say thank you very much for participating. Thank you for using your time, and thank you for all the very good questions. I hope that we managed to answer at least 95% of all the questions that were sent in. So thank you for engagement, participation, and let's watch the AI generated video about what challenges do we have in restoration context. I say thank you very much and take care.
Marine restoration is a complex yet critical endeavour, facing substantial challenges, high costs, technical difficulties, and limited knowledge about underwater ecosystems hinder progress. While progress on restoration methods have been made for some habitats, like stone reefs and eelgrass beds, restoration methods for specific habitats remain underdeveloped. Adding to this, the pressures of pollution, eutrophication, and climate change exacerbate ecosystem degradation, while human activities like coastal development continue to reduce critical habitats. Without holistic land-sea approaches, these barriers make large-scale marine recovery an uphill battle. Overcoming these challenges requires bold and coordinated action. Funding, research, and political commitment are vital, as are efforts to raise ocean knowledge and public awareness. Collaboration among Nordic and Baltic countries can help share knowledge, test innovative methods, and tackle common issues like eutrophication and climate impacts. Crucially, addressing the root causes of degradation and preventing further destruction are essential to ensure restoration efforts are not in vain. If we succeed, the rewards are immense. Restored habitats could rebuild biodiversity, revitalize depleted stocks, and create resilient ecosystems capable of adapting to future challenges. This would bring tangible benefits: healthier oceans, improved climate resilience, better public health, and strengthened economies. By allowing marine environments to heal and thrive, we secure a sustainable and vibrant future for both nature and society.